Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Welcome back to my messy kitchen. And today, I'm going to perform a miracle. Well, at least it's going to look like a miracle to folks who are accustomed to conventional sourdough knowledge. Because today I am going to bake a perfect loaf of sourdough bread using a sourdough starter that has not been fed in over 5 months. You heard that right. You do not have to feed your sourdough starter. Certainly not as often as people think you do. And it is literally impossible to kill sourdough starter as long as it's been living in the refrigerator. It will happily live for months on end without a single feeding and then bake you a perfect loaf of sourdough bread if you follow my simple sourdough method. Now, I'm not going to teach you all the details of that method today because there's another YouTube video that's going to do that. But first, we're going to take a look at this old sourdough starter. Now, I created this sourdough starter at the end of April, April 24th, for my sourdough starter series. This starter was created with simple all-purpose flour and water and nothing else. And you'll notice this like nasty layer of water on top of there. A lot of folks call that hooch. The first most important thing you must never do when your sourdough starter looks like this is to pour that off. This is part of your sourdough. It needs to be in there. It accounts for a lot of the flavor that's incorporated into your sourdough bread. But if you pour it off, you're going to screw up the hydration of your starter, and you no longer have equal parts of flour and water in your starter, which means your recipe is going to mess up. Your bread dough is going to be either too dry or too wet. It's going to screw everything up. So when you do have this nasty hooch stuff, give it a sniff because it's interesting. It smells kind of like a combination of moonshine and vinegar. And just stir that back into your starter until it's well incorporated. Now, this isn't even a really mature sort of a legacy starter. It was created from scratch just until it reached maturity, which took a little less than 2 weeks. It was given 1 feeding, put back in the fridge, and there it's been since. I have not used it. And we're going to see if we can't coax a perfect loaf of bread out of it. So we're starting here with 4 ounces of this weak starter. Now, this starter looks like it's exceptionally liquidy and runny, right? Your starter should never look like this right after you feed it. It should look almost as thick as bread dough. But over time, the acid in this sourdough starter breaks down all the protein or the strands of gluten in that starter, and it looks like it's super, super liquidy. But starter should never look like this right after you've fed it. However, I am confident that that's a 100% hydration starter. It has and always has contained equal portions of flour and water. 12 fluid ounces of filtered water. Stir those around to get them incorporated. 1 pound 4 ounces all-purpose flour. You can certainly use bread flour, but I have a fairly small kitchen. I can't keep a whole bunch of different specialty flours around, and I've discovered that this just organic all-purpose flour from Costco is a good universal flour. I use it for all of my baking. If you use bread flour or add some vital wheat gluten to your bread, it's going to give it an even nicer rise, but I just want to show you that plain old all-purpose flour will bake a perfect loaf. And 3/4 of an ounce of salt. Now, if you want to bitch about the salt content in this bread and tell me that it's too much, go on over to my troubleshooting simple sourdough video and watch that. You'll find out why the high amount of salt in this recipe is actually the key to this recipe working. If you decrease the amount of salt, it becomes a much more finicky recipe and won't always turn out a perfect loaf for you. All right, we're going to stir these guys together. Finish off with our hands just to bring everything together, incorporating all of that flour from the bottom of the bowl. Okay, dough is ready. And as you've probably learned from my other videos, that is all you have to do on the first day. It is super easy, less than 5 minutes. And we're only going to have to spend about 10 minutes with it tomorrow until it's done and perfectly good. So this particular technique is just super, super incredible for folks who are really lazy like me, want to be able to have delicious sourdough bread without very much effort, especially feeding your sourdough starter every day or two. Now, to kind of give us a control version, I'm going to start another loaf here momentarily with my legacy starter. Now, this is the starter that I keep in my fridge all the time. I've had it for over a decade. Now, this sourdough starter hasn't actually been fed in over a week. That's already way outside the time limit for feeding starters for virtually every sourdough starter method that's out there. They really do want you to give your starter at least 1 feeding in the hours before you bake bread, and hopefully it's been fed regularly every, ideally 36 hours throughout the course of its entire lifetime. That results in a whole lot of waste though. You're discarding sourdough starter every time you feed it, and unless you've got a ton of recipes and a ton of time to use up that sourdough starter, all of that discarding is a horrible waste of starter. With my simple sourdough method, you really don't ever have to feed your starter at all until you get low on starter, and then you just feed it to make more. So you're never actually discarding starter at all. But this is my legacy starter. It's super happy and healthy, even though it hasn't eaten in over a week. And I'm just going to mix up a quick loaf of this, and then I'll be right back. All right, I've got both of my loaves started here. It's about 2 p.m. this afternoon, so we are going to check back tomorrow. Now, we're not going to hold both of these loaves to the same standard in terms of the time for them to rise or proof. This is the one variable in sourdough baking that no recipe can ever teach you, and you will develop an intuition for it the more often you bake. Now, I happen to know that my legacy starter, as long as it's been fed within the last month, is only going to take 12 to 14 hours to rise a loaf until it's time to shape it, and then 2 hours later it can go into the oven. If I haven't fed my starter in 3 or 4 months, or like this 5-month-old completely starving brand new starter, that starter is going to take a little bit more time. Luckily, more time during the rising or fermentation period results in more flavor. And all of these overly complicated, high hydration sourdough recipes, when you watch those videos and are like, I am not going to do that much work to bake just one loaf of bread, right? The goal of those is really those big, beautiful air holes. The goal is not necessarily flavor. Well, why do I want a loaf of bread with giant holes in it? A hole doesn't have any flavor. I can't spread butter or olive oil or jam on a hole, right? So they are looking for a visual component to their bread that is stunning to look at. And that's great. They can do that. It takes a lot of work. I'm all about ease and flavor. The longer that bread rises, the more flavor it's going to have. So I'll see you guys tomorrow, and we'll take a look at how our respective loaves of bread have risen. It's been 18 hours, and the loaf made with my legacy starter, which hadn't been fed in a week, is absolutely ready to be formed. It's probably going to be able to go into the oven in another 2 to 3 hours. Not unexpectedly, the loaf begun with our starving starter is sluggish to catch up. Now that's perfectly normal. We're not seeing nearly as much CO2 inflate the bag. However, the slow metabolic process of the yeast in this dough that's taking a lot longer to wake up is going to reward us with flavor, if not quite as much impressive CO2 production as we see in the starter that's been fed within the last week. I'm going to go ahead and shape this loaf. A little over 2 hours later, and the loaf made with my legacy starter is ready to be baked. I've got my screaming hot Dutch oven here. I'm going to do the simple scoring method with scissors. And then very carefully transfer the loaf into that hot Dutch. I'm going to get it covered and into the oven. We are at the 24-hour mark with our starving loaf, and I know from previous experience that I could actually shape this into a loaf now and bake it, but I really do want to show you the potential that these starving starter loaves have to really make a nice airy loaf like the ones you make with starter that's been recently fed. So I'm going to let this continue to rise until I see just a little bit more lift and volume in this dough. Looking at it now, you definitely see plenty of interior air holes, but we don't have nearly the carbon dioxide production that we did have with the loaf made with starter that was fed about a week ago. Our starving loaf has been rising for about 30 hours now. It's getting close to the time when I really would not want to form a loaf and then wait another 4 to 6 hours to put it in the oven, because I'm going to be asleep by that time. The beautiful thing about this simple sourdough method is its flexibility in terms of timing. I'm going to leave this overnight. I'm not going to come back to it for another 12 to 14 hours. And it's still going to be okay. And because this starter hasn't eaten in 5 months, I know that all this time I'm just building flavor as those yeast slowly start to awaken. Now, we've definitely had a significant amount of activity that's noticeable. We've increased in volume, we've got more CO2 inflating the bag, and we've got some really, really lovely air bubbles showing where the bag contacts the dough. But with this particular method, as long as your starter is not super robust and raring to go, having been kept at a highly active rate by regular feedings, it's going to be perfectly fine for me to leave this for another 12 hours because it's not going to overproof. The salt content is helping keep the yeast under control. It's also helping strengthen the gluten network so that we're capturing all of that extra CO2, and it's going to be totally fine for me to go to bed and worry about tomorrow. See you then. I woke up the next morning and take a look at this. This dough looks incredible. We've got really nice CO2 buildup here in the bag. The dough just looks light and airy and wonderful. I'm so impressed. It's been 42 hours since I mixed this dough together with our starving starter, and it is ready to shape. Now this is the first time that I have baked a loaf of bread with starter that hasn't been fed in 5 months. So there's really no way for me to predict whether this second rise is going to take 2 hours or 6 or even 8 hours. But the nice thing about this technique is that you are never at the bread's beck and call. So many other sourdough recipes out there require you to interact with the dough every hour to 2 hours for an entire day or two, slapping and folding and building strength. 2 days ago, it took me less than 5 minutes to start this loaf, and then I've just maybe checked on it twice in the last 2 days. Now it's Monday morning, I'm ready to go to work, I've shaped my loaf. So if I know I'm not going to have time to bake it until I get home from work, it's just going to go right in the refrigerator. When I get home from work, I'll pull it out of the fridge, let it sit on the countertop for 2 or 3 hours, and then put it in the oven. Simple as that. However, it's the coronavirus pandemic, so I'm working from home today. I'll be able to watch it, preheat the oven when it looks like it's getting close to doubling, and then bake it. 5 hours later, and it looks like our bread is ready to go into the oven. Now, normally, if I'm working with a starter that's starved, hasn't been fed in months, I'll actually bake in a smaller Dutch oven, a 3.5 quart. That gives the sides of the loaves a little bit of support as the bread rises, resulting in a noticeably taller and more open loaf. But for the sake of this experiment, to compare it to the other loaf made from the starter fed a week before, I'm going to bake it in the same pot just so we can directly see exactly how the lack of feeding makes a difference. I'm going to go ahead and do the simple score with the scissors, transfer it into my really hot preheated Dutch oven here, and it's going into the oven. Our starving loaf has baked and cooled, and I know I keep saying look at that, but will you look at that? This is a spectacular loaf of bread. I cannot get over it. It rose even more beautifully than our loaf made with the starter that was fed a week ago. Of course, it did proof for longer, especially on the first rise. But if anybody tells you that your starter is lifeless if you haven't fed it in 5 months, they are flat wrong. Now it's time to cut into these babies and see what they look like on the inside. Of course, this is the control loaf that was baked yesterday, so it's been out staling for about a day. A little bit tougher to cut through because of that. Got a very nice crumb for sandwich bread or from eating out of hand. Decent aeration, lovely smell, a little bit tart. It's a very nice loaf. Now let's check out the starving loaf. A little bit lighter crumb, slightly larger air bubbles. Smells noticeably more sour. Just a really, really beautiful, soft, spongy interior. What we don't see on either of these loaves are those big, beautiful, giant air holes that taste like absolutely nothing. Again, those breads are gorgeous, but in my opinion, it's completely not worth the effort. When you don't have to worry about feeding your starter on a regular schedule, you only have to feed it when you need to make more of it, so you're never wasting any starter by discarding it. And all you have to do is kind of like ignore the bread for a day or two and let it make itself. Win-win situation for me, folks. We also definitely have to taste these. Lovely flavor. Very moist, light and airy. It's a perfect loaf of bread. Now for the starving loaf. Definitely a little bit more sour, but a much broader complexity and flavor. And that's thanks to that extra day that the bread rose. So in a sense, starving your starter for months on end results in a more perfect loaf as long as you're willing to give it time. It's really fascinating stuff. Folks, if you can't tell, I absolutely love turning convention on its end. You won't find many people out there that tell you to just ignore your starter and only feed it when you need to make more. And if your starter's been in the fridge for 5 months without a feeding, go ahead and use it to make bread. No need to feed it. But it's just the way my weird brain works. I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Hit me up on my website, benstarr.com. Find me on Facebook and subscribe to my YouTube channel for lots more awesome kitchen stuff. Thanks for watching.